Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for pressing play on my Memorial Day special. And this only happened because of listeners like you who obviously support the podcast with a paid subscription, but specifically because of our friend Brady in Arkansas, who sent me an email saying, hey, why don't you play some of your best of, some of your favorite conversations during your week off? And I thought, well, the least I can do is play the most obvious one for Memorial Day, my conversation with Kenneth C Davis about the history of Memorial Day. And that is what I have for you. I do have a couple of other conversations that you haven't heard coming up this week as well. I'm very much looking forward to sharing those, and you can find them here while I'm off. That's right. I'm off on, quote, vacation, trying to do, quote, nothing. So far, so good. Anyway, don'tknowmuch.com. That's Kenneth C Davis's website if you want to go check that out. But he has a very provocative piece up at don'tknowmuch.com about Memorial Day, of course, observed here the last Monday of May, honoring the men and women who died while serving the U.S. military. But he writes at his blog, let's set the record straight. Memorial Day is about slavery. It's not about swimsuit sales, the start of summer, or hot dogs on the Barbie. Barbie? Really, Ken? Do we say that? He goes on to say, Memorial Day, the most solemn occasion on the national calendar, now honors the nation's war dead. But it was born out of the Civil War, which was fought because of slavery, America's original sin. Memorial Day is about a nation, quote, conceived in liberty, but born in shackles. And in these fraught times when teaching history has become so contentious, we must tell it straight when we observe the history behind the holiday. And that is what Kenneth C Davis does on today's episode of Stand Up, which you can find in the archives, but now as a best of right here. don'tknowmuch.com. Learn more about Ken. Thank you for your support. Really appreciate you. Hey, maybe we'll even get some new subscriptions coming in on the week off. Wouldn't that be crazy? Let's do it right now with my all-time favorite historian. You should get all of his books, read them all, hire him to speak to your library or your school or your family or whatever. Bring him in for dinner. The guy is so much fun and such a brilliant historian. This conversation originally posted back in Memorial Day 2022. I'm very happy Brady suggested I bring something back for this week, and this is it. Let's do it with Kenneth C Davis. There he is. I've just told you all about the legend, and we were just talking, and it's 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago that we first connected after I spent a couple weeks during the summer reading Don't Know Much About History. It changed my life and said, would be a dream for me to get this guy on the show. I guess that's when it was.
Well, and very appropriate to today's conversation, we first started talking many years ago about the Civil War and the myths about it, the mistaken impressions about it. And that was, 10 years ago before the real rage over statues and teaching how we teach history began in the past few years. But this is a subject that's gone very deep and been very, very misunderstood, misinterpreted, but mostly mistaught for not 10 years or 20 years, but for 150 years in this country. So it's a very deep-seated argument. And of course, when we talk about Memorial Day, we are talking about the Civil War. And I've always loved to talk about this holiday because to me, growing up as a kid in Mount Vernon, New York, just outside of New York City, Memorial Day was the big day on the calendar. Much more important in some ways than the 4th of July was, because that happened in the summertime. We were out of school. Right. But Memorial Day, which when I was a child always fell on May 30th, and we'll talk about that. But it was the day that it wasn't a day off so much. It was the day that the entire community got together. So all of the schools marched and they had bands that played in the Memorial Day parade. All of the Boy Scouts and the Cub Scouts marched. Local veterans groups marched. And, I am, my father is long gone, but I was the child of a World War II veteran. This was a very real and meaningful holiday to us. Right. And because we participated in it in a very local way, it was very deep for me as a kid. So, and I remember the vets coming into the schoolroom. They would come into the classroom just before Memorial Day, and they would sell those little paper poppies. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I don't.
It's still used to be the VFW or the American Legion would sell these paper poppies as the symbol of Memorial Day. And I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes too, why the poppy is so significant. But I remember they would come into the classroom and you'd have a quarter and you would buy one of those poppies. And that was, it was a really meaningful thing as a child. Of course, we celebrated Christmas and all the other holidays and Thanksgiving, historical holidays. But Memorial Day was particularly significant.
Is it true that you and your classmates boiled the poppies down and sold them for black tar heroin? Is that accurate?
We're first of all talking about paper poppies, so no, we couldn't do such a thing.
So you rolled them up. This was what year was this?
Well, I'm talking about my childhood, not my teenage years.
Well, let's get to the.
We won't go into rolling papers just today. Again, this is a sacred holiday. So
it is a sacred holiday, and so that's exactly what I wanted to make the point of. You, because of your age, being the son of a World War II veteran, and so people your generation thought about it one way. Me and my daughters think about it another way. I have no idea how my daughters think about it. I would love to say that we have some kind of traditional thing that recognizes it, but we're no better than any other garbage American, and we have everybody over or we do a thing. But for me growing up, it was the Final Four for the NCAA lacrosse tournament, which I cared so much about. The point being, my generation and my daughter's generation don't see it the way you do, which is why your work is so important. Your generation does, right?
Yeah. So let me start with what it is, because, when I started talking and writing about this a long time ago, and historic holidays have always been meaningful, always fun, always important to talk about. But this one is more important because it is truly the most solemn day on the American national calendar. Most people do tend to see it as the kickoff to summertime. And I understand that. 3-day weekend, weather's getting hot. The rentals in the Hamptons start for those of us who can rent in the Hamptons or, go into the Jersey Shore, or all those things that we think of as the beginning of summer. You can wear.
Wow, that was a very northeastern central summer plan for my national audience. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'm showing my geographic bias here. But the point is that most people think of it as the kickoff to the summertime and sales. It's going to be, I don't know, swimsuit sales or, beach sales or whatever. This is the big weekend for that. And I understand that and I appreciate it. And I think that's a good thing to celebrate. But this is the most solemn day on the holiday calendar because it is a day that specifically is meant to honor those who gave their lives in service to the country in wartime. Those who gave what Abraham Lincoln called very famously the last full measure of devotion in the Gettysburg Address. So it is. It's not a celebratory holiday, and it's not Veterans Day. I know everyone will say thank a veteran this holiday weekend, but Veterans Day, November 11th, is something different. It honors all those who served, whether they're living or dead, in all of our wars. But Memorial Day is specifically for those men and women who gave their lives in service to the country. It was born. We talked about the Civil War to start this off, so let me connect it back.
Yeah, why?
This holiday.
Do you think most people don't realize the connection between Memorial Day and the Civil War? Because you teach me every year, and I forget every year.
Well, that's why I keep talking about it every year. I would have thought, well, I taught everybody about this, 10, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But no, we have to keep coming back because it's easily forgotten. And it is so inundated by the media coverage of Memorial Day as the kickoff of the summertime. And I understand that. The traffic reports, the beach reports will become more interesting. Will there be fireworks or not? So this, I get that, but I do want people to understand the significance of this. And more important this year, and I've talked about this actually the last couple of years, is the significance of this holiday in terms of the nation's racial history.
Right.
And I know there are people who are going to say, oh, you can't make everything about race. But this holiday is in essence about race and slavery and that piece of our history that we like to not talk about too much, especially now. And we don't want to, there are places that wouldn't even allow me to say it in school. The Memorial Day was born out of the ashes of the Civil War. 4 years of fighting ends in 1865. More than 600,000 Americans have died. That number, by the way, some think is as high as 750,000. It was an enormous percent of the American population at the time, more than 2%. So we'd be talking about 7 million people dying if we had a war of that magnitude today, just to put it into some perspective. So there was no city or town or village in this country that existed at the time that wasn't really affected personally by what was going on in the Civil War for 4 years. And that's why if you drive around whatever part of the country you're in, north or south, defeated Southern Confederacy states, you often see the Civil War memorial in the center of town. It's certainly true in New England. The Civil War was the central event in our history for a very, very long time. It's one of the reasons I wrote a book just about the Civil War. Don't know much about the Civil War. Somewhere it's behind me. And it's the reason I came back and wrote In the Shadow of Liberty, that book about the importance of slavery in our history. Yeah. When the war was over, about 3 years later, there was a very prominent politician named General John Logan. He had been a Civil War general. He was a Republican senator from Illinois, very powerful Republican senator, but he was also the head of a fraternal organization called the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic was the American Legion or the VFW of its day, and it was very Republican, and it was very powerful, and it was a political force. Logan, as the head of this ceremonial group, announced in 1868 that we will set aside May 30th as a day to go out to the cemetery and put fresh flowers on the graves of the fallen Union soldiers who had fallen in an attempt to end slavery for a race in chains and to also end a rebellion, a tyranny. That's what he called the Confederacy. So the first Memorial Day is actually called Decoration Day because you were going to go and decorate the graves of the soldiers, was really specifically a Union holiday and meant to honor the memory of the men, mostly men, who died fighting to end slavery, because that's what the Civil War had certainly become. Even if people didn't think that's what it was about when it began, it certainly was, but that's what it clearly was. And when Abraham Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address in 1863, he makes it very clear that that's what this war is about. Sure. To ensure the promise of the Declaration of Independence. And so you cannot separate this holiday from its roots as the crusade to end slavery, this horrific stain on this country's history. You can't separate this holiday from that past. Now, what's interesting is that as time went by, through the late 1860s, by the early turn of the 20th century, the reason for Memorial Day had been forgotten. 50 years had passed, and people were starting to already treat it as a summer picnic holiday. It was also not a federal national holiday. I have to make that very clear. This was something that was done by different states. So each state would declare May 30th the Decoration Day. Later, they started to call it Memorial Day because not everyone was going to decorate graves with fresh flowers. I should also point out that in the Southern Confederacy states, the former Confederacy, they did not honor this day because it was seen as a Union or Northern holiday. and they began to mark their own separate Confederate Memorial Days or Decorations Days. Some of them on Robert E. Lee's birthday, some of them on Jefferson Davis's birthday. So from the very beginning, this was a divisive, partisan holiday, even though it was dedicated to the remembrance of those who had died in service to their countries. Go ahead.
Well, let me just ask you. I mean, listen. When I'm interviewing you, you can just talk, and I'll say a word or two here. But if you want, I would. I'm always interested in kind of how Memorial Day evolved over different conflicts and how it related to different conflicts. And again, going back to your earlier point, I suppose to some extent it relates to those who are still living who might have lost someone. So now we can certainly look at the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, where many of the widows are in their 40s, maybe. There are many kids that are still not probably still, I think, in high school, if not younger. So how does Memorial Day evolve with war and conflict that America is involved with, from World War II to Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan and all of the other conflicts that we don't probably talk about nearly enough?
Really good. A great question, Pete. Wow. You asked such great questions. I was kind of starting to get at that, and let me back up because it's much older than that, than our recent wars.
Sure.
By the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, the Civil War was fading from memory, and Memorial Day had already become this family picnic holiday. Then World War I comes about. 1918, 100,000 soldiers, American soldiers, die in 1 year of fighting, about a year of fighting. The United States, the war had started in 1914. The United States didn't get involved in 1917 and really didn't send a large number of troops until 1918. And of course, we've talked about this in light of the fact that World War I was also the year of the Great Influenza. So a lot of those soldiers actually died of the flu. Just to bring all this history together. What happened, though, was that America was certainly a more, I should say, a less divided country along those old Civil War lines. And so Memorial Day in 1919 became a day now to recognize that this was going to acknowledge all of the soldiers who died in all of America's wars, going back to the Revolution, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the Mexican War. There were many other wars besides the Civil War, and this was now recognition that this could be a holiday that we think about as an American Memorial Day, and that's what it began. It was 2 years later, in 1921, that they created the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, specifically to honor a soldier who died fighting in World War I, whose remains were unidentified. And so that soldier was entombed in the Tomb of the Unknowns, and it was opened to great ceremony in 1921. By the way, Arlington Cemetery, this extraordinarily sacred space. If you go to Washington, if you do all the sites, make time. It's really worth it to see this place. It's
I've been there a couple times. Yeah, absolutely. A really good point. By the way, did America come up with the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier? Was that like other nations' past history probably had come up with that over and over?
Yeah, I believe both the British and the French had such a thing. All so right. Yes, that was clear. But just another point to the divisiveness of the Civil War and the connections to Memorial Day. Arlington Cemetery, if you visited there, you would know this, was created out of land that was confiscated from the family of Robert E. Lee.
Right.
And his home is in the middle of Arlington Cemetery. And, during the Civil War, Lincoln would be in the White House and look across the river towards Arlington, and he'd see Confederate flags flying. So this land was confiscated during the war. And one of the generals in the Union, whose son had died, thought it would be fitting to turn Robert E. Lee's property into a cemetery. Really kind of tremendously ironic, but powerful statement. So that is once again the connection. And early in the celebrations of Decoration Day or Memorial Day, they would actually set up guards at Arlington to keep any Confederate families out of the cemetery that day, because there are a few Confederate soldiers buried there. There are also unidentified what were called USCT, U.S. Colored Troops.
Oh, wow.
They are also in Arlington, mostly unidentified. But yes, the Tomb of the Unknowns was a European idea, and then was recreated here. As we've had future wars, a soldier from World War II, a soldier from the Korean War were also entombed in the Tomb of the Unknowns. Eventually, a soldier from Vietnam was placed there, but he was eventually identified, and because the DNA technology became more sophisticated, they were able to identify that soldier.
That's interesting.
His remains were eventually returned. I believe he's in the National Cemetery in St. Louis now. So this speaks to your question. As we went through a series of other wars, Memorial Day changed. Decoration Day eventually came Memorial Day. Finally becomes a national holiday, and is moved to the last Monday in May, away from the traditional date of May 30th, creating another 3-day weekend when we had this Uniform Holidays Act. A lot of people feel that might have lessened the holiday. I don't think so. I think it's always been seen as a weekend getaway kind of holiday. But one more important point, and this was very true for me as I was growing up, during the Vietnam era, Memorial Day kind of lost some of its widespread appeal. It was not the honored day it had been in the past because of the unpopularity of the Vietnam War. And I'm talking about the late 60s into the early 70s. And it was a long time. And Vietnam vets, probably some in your audience, will tell you that they did not get the reception, and the losses in Vietnam did not get the honor that they deserved, because those guys didn't choose to go there for the most part. Many volunteers, but most draftees. Those people felt like Memorial Day didn't really apply to them. And it was only, I think, as late as the Gulf War era that Vietnam veterans began to be much more appreciated. And of course, the creation of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is absolutely one of the most stunning places in Washington, D.C. I never fail to go when I'm in Washington. You go to the Lincoln Monument, the memorial, you read his words, read the words of the Gettysburg Address, and then you walk down to this, pit in our soul of this scar that's been carved into the earth there. It is absolutely one of the most moving, emotional places in Washington, D.C., as far as I'm concerned.
I second that entirely. I took my wife and daughters there, and it was very impactful, profoundly impactful.
Just to quickly finish up on this point, I think that it took a long time for the Vietnam era vets to get the recognition and the honor they deserve, and certainly the loss of those 58,000 plus lives in Vietnam. So that's why the holiday has become, I think, much more significant as a national holiday, but people still, for the most part, don't truly understand its meaning.
How then, getting back to the question, has it evolved for different generations? How is it different for the Iraq and Afghanistan, families? Because again, they grew up with me. And there are all kinds of Memorial Day traditions that probably a lot of us had that had nothing to do with the meaning of Memorial Day. And that's why we identify with them. How else did that change with different generations?
That's a good question. This is probably a point I should go back to the history of World War I and mention that's where the poppy comes from.
Yeah.
during World War One, a Canadian doctor who was in the army was serving in Belgium, France, and he goes to this very, very famous battlefield where they'd gone back and forth for years, called Flanders. And he sees a burial ground, and his friends are there. And he writes this poem that begins, "In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row by row." Really, it's a wonderful poem. It's a very, very elegiac poem. He also later died, the man who wrote the poem. A young American woman
in the war.
This poem. He died in the war, during the war. I'm not sure if he died of illness rather than being wounded, because he was a medical doctor. So I don't think he was a battlefield casualty, probably an illness casualty, although I'm not sure. I don't think he was a victim of the influenza that killed a lot of soldiers, by the way.
You wrote a whole book about it.
This young woman in America knows this poem. It's a very well-known poem published around the world. And she decides that the poppy, this blood red flower with the dark center, is the perfect symbol of loss and remembrance. And she starts a movement called the Poppy Movement to sell flowers to raise money for the widows and orphans of the men lost in World War I. And so that's how the poppy becomes a symbol then of loss and remembrance. And it's very true in England as well. And I think in the 2018, they celebrate their Remembrance Day on the day that we call Veterans Day, November 11th, the day that the war ended in Europe in 1918. And England was covered in poppies because of this. So that's where the poppy comes from as the symbol.
And you were also going to say about, go back to May 30th, the significance.
Yeah, the May 30th date, it's interesting. It didn't really have any special meaning in terms of a date. It turns out that it was chosen because it was the day that the most flowers are in bloom in the northern states. So there would be plenty of flowers to take out to the cemetery. And it was a kind of arbitrary choice. And then later, as I said, when I was a kid, we always celebrated on May 30th. In 1968, they introduced what they called the Uniform Holidays Act, and that changed it to a 3-day Monday holiday. But the real problem with the fact that it's a holiday and it is the summer is that people don't understand this very deep history. And back to your question about how different eras have seen it.
Yeah.
One thing I would say for sure is that my father's generation, my father's war, World War II, my uncles were in Korea. These were wars that were fought by many more people than became typically true. That changed because of Vietnam. When we moved from a draft.
Right.
And many more people were affected by going to war and going into the military. The transition to an all-volunteer army, which came about during Vietnam, I think changed perhaps some of the public attitudes towards military service. Vietnam also put a kind of a damper on that. So what was for me and my generation growing up, seeing our fathers, our uncles, my wife's father was also a World War II vet. This was, it was a much more personal thing.
Right.
Vietnam sort of changed our attitudes about the military in some ways. And then the volunteer army changed the general public's view. Very, very few Americans at this time know anybody personally who's in the service. Right. Very, very few. I mean, it's like 1% of the general population. So we have these kind of, oh, thank a vet, or thank you for your service at the airport if we see somebody in uniform. But it doesn't have the visceral effect that World War II and Vietnam had with, much greater numbers of loss. Right. But that certainly doesn't change. Every loss is a loss. And for all of those families, this is a day we should set aside to think about them.
No, but what you're saying is that when there's not as much loss or there's disproportionate loss, then certainly traditions and celebrations of life or loss, like Memorial Day, are just less. You're less attentive to them. They are defined or completely undefined or redefined in terms of a sale or, as I said earlier, a sporting event or any number of things that people have redefined it to mean, right?
Yeah, completely. But you'll still see, and again, being perhaps in New York or maybe a large city, any other large city, you don't have the sense that I know exists in smaller communities where the graveyard cemetery is celebration or ceremony, not celebration. The ceremonies still go on. I used to live and be very often in a small town in Vermont at this time of year, and every year they had a small parade. I'm talking about a few dozen people, led by a World War II veteran who would march to the little graveyard in this town where there were Revolutionary War veterans still buried. And so they marked it. So I think in a lot of small towns, you still have a little bit more of that feeling, that small town America feeling that connects to that
no doubt
very old history. And then the other thing is that in a lot of the national cemeteries, the national cemeteries that are designated for veterans, the Boy Scouts, I know it happens in Arlington, the Army actually goes out and puts a flag on every grave in Arlington. They start a few days early to get to them all. It's called Flags In. And it's, again, very moving when you go and see all of those flags. And this happens at other cemeteries. And so I think you see that in small towns and other communities that we don't necessarily feel in the bustle of a big city.
Right.
Here in New York, it's typically, they have Fleet Week. You and I got together by the Intrepid once upon a time, and all the sailors and Marines are in town.
I'll re-release that segment. It's one of the things that I did at CNN that I was most proud of, and I basically went down to the Hudson where Fleet Week occurs. All the big ships are in, and there's a whole bunch of veterans there. And what I did, folks, was I interviewed veterans who were just there and commemorating, and I brought or invited Professor Davis to come down there with me and give us a history lesson. Of course, they chopped the shit out of it because it's CNN, but it's a couple minutes with he and I, at least, I think, and it's a great lesson, and it's always relevant, and so I'll put it back out there, even though I don't have a beard and look like a naked mole rat. So I interrupted you just to mention that I'll reshare it because I'm really proud of it. But where were we?
It was a memorable time, and I know that at Fleet Week it concludes on Memorial Day, and they put a wreath in the water off the Intrepid, but that it's a nice gesture, and it doesn't have quite the intensity, I think, that going to a cemetery and seeing one of these ceremonies has. The Congress asks us to do one thing on Monday, Memorial Day, which is at 3:00, I presume local time, a moment of silence. I always suggest the very simplest thing to do, and it's a good thing to do anytime, but on Memorial Day in particular, read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 200 words plus words, takes about 2.5 minutes to read. That's how long it took Lincoln to recite it. It says everything there is to say about this holiday and what it should mean, and talks about the reason these soldiers died at Gettysburg when he dedicates that cemetery in November 1863. And it is, I think, the most perfect explanation of what we should be thinking about and honoring on this very, very important and solemn day.
Well, maybe a good place to end. I'd love to hear anything else. One last point, if you want to make it, or we can end there. I just set an alarm as you were talking in my phone to alert me of that moment of silence on Monday. Let's see. We'll see if I adhere to it or if the alarm goes off. But Anything else, Ken, before I let you go? I've taken up so much of your time, and I so appreciate it.
No, I love to talk about this stuff. It's really important to understand this history, to understand its connection to our present, because that's the real reason I like to talk about history. Is not to know the dates and the battles and the speeches, but to understand how the past created the present that we are in, and what lessons we should have learned and usually don't from the past. There's more about Memorial Day on my website right now, don'tknowmuch.com. You can go there and find a little bit more about the history and some of the traditions that we've been talking about here today. You'll also find out that I have a new book coming out next November called Great Short Books, and a little bit of a departure from my recent work, but I'm very excited about that.
And I am very excited about that. I'm always excited about you. I should have said this at the top. I'll say it here at the end. Happy birthday. The 21st of May, if you want to put it in your calendar for next year, is when young baby, little tiny baby, Kenny, they could probably called you Kenny or something, came into the world. And we are so happy that he did, because people constantly tell me, when they name their favorite guests on the show, or the shows that they never miss, I pump them out every day, that they never miss my conversation with you. And so we celebrate you as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Happy birthday. And I will talk to you soon, sir.
Thank you, Pete. My father called me by my initials, which are KC. So I was Casey.
Wow.
To my veteran father. But nobody else called me that.
Well, and that's about to change, sir.
And it's really always been a pleasure to talk to you, Pete. I know we have fun talking about history. This day is not fun. I always struggle. What do you say? You don't say Happy Memorial Day.
Yeah.
I guess I just hope people will take the time to learn a little bit more about it, learn about the traditions. And as I said, you can do worse than read Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So thank you, my friend. Always a pleasure. And we'll talk down the road, because not far off is Juneteenth.
Yes, what's next?
July.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say, what's next? I look forward to the next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete.
All right, there he goes. Kenneth C Davis, the replay from Memorial Day, May 2022. And thanks again, Brady, for the idea. And if you have any other old shows, past shows you wanted me to re-air, I am interested in doing that. Maybe let me know what you think. Think about it. Okay, well, that's it. Now back to vacation. Thanks so much for listening. I miss you. And tell Kenneth C Davis you heard him. Go buy his book. All right, bye-bye.
When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. We got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. While you lying awake wondering where the money all went, it'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up, stand up. Got to stand up. Ooh, come on, just stand up. Everybody got to stand up in the darkest hour. Stand up. People got the power. Stand up. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Come on, come on, come on. Stand